Most people imagine the time of Jesus as a soft, spiritual world. Dusty roads, sandals, quiet sermons about love and morality, a distant religious past that feels separate from real life. But for the people actually living their life wasn't defined by theology, it was defined by money, or more accurately, by how little of it they had. The world into which Jesus was born was shaped by one of the most unequal economic systems the ancient Mediterranean had ever known. This wasn't a moral failure of individuals, it was a machine, and Judea was trapped inside it. Welcome to American Life Guide, where we look past comforting stories and examine how power, money, and history actually work. At the beginning of the 1st century, Judea existed on the outer edge of the Roman Empire. Rome was not an empire built on partnership. It was an extraction system. Provinces weren't conquered to be developed. They were conquered to be drained. Grain, silver, labor, and taxes flowed outward from the margins and inward toward Rome itself. Judea was one of those margins. And it was already fragile. Most people lived in small agricultural households, farming tiny plots of land, just large enough to survive. These weren't businesses, they were lifelines. One failed harvest didn't mean reduced profits, it meant hunger. And Rome didn't pause for bad weather. Governance in Judea was simple and brutal. Rome ruled through local elites and appointed officials. Kings like Herod ruled only with Roman approval. After his death, prefects like Pontius Pilate took direct control. Their job wasn't to improve life. It was to keep order and make sure revenue never stopped moving. Taxes were the backbone of this system. And these weren't taxes based on income or success. They were taxes based on existence. Land taxes, produce taxes, head taxes, road tolls, market fees. On top of that, religious taxes enforced by temple authorities. Miss a payment and there was no mercy, no appeals process, no second chances. Tax collection was outsourced to contractors known as tax farmers. They paid Rome up front for the right to collect, then recovered their costs by squeezing the population as hard as possible. Abuse wasn't a mistake. It was the business model. When people couldn't pay, they borrowed. Debt was everywhere, and unlike modern debt, there were no escape valves, no bankruptcy, no restructuring. Interest piled up quickly. Land was used as collateral. One bad year could destroy a family permanently. The cycle was relentless. A farmer planted crops. Weather failed. Taxes were still due. He borrowed from a wealthy lender, often connected to local elites or temple authorities. Interest grew. The next year barely covered survival. Eventually the land was seized. Farmer became a tenant on his own former property, or a day laborer, or vanished from the records entirely. This wasn't accidental, it was structural. Over time, land concentrated into fewer hands. Large estates replaced family plots. Wealth clustered around elites tied to Roman power and religious authority. Poverty didn't just exist, it was reproduced generation after generation. There was no safety net, no public aid, no unemployment support. Family was the only protection. Charity existed, but it was limited and inconsistent. When too many people fell at once, the system simply let them fall. Debt wasn't just financial, it was social. Losing land meant losing status, identity, and future security. A single drought, tax hike, or missed payment could erase a family's entire legacy. This is the world Jesus entered, and it's important to say this clearly. And people weren't poor because they were lazy, immoral, or cursed. They were poor because the system required them to be. Rome needed surplus. Local elites needed rent. The temple needed revenue. All of that pressure landed on people with no margin for error. The result was tension. Judea was never calm. Rebellions erupted constantly. Banditry wasn't just crime, it was desperation. Groups formed promising relief, justice, reversal. Messianic movements didn't emerge in comfort. They emerged in collapse. This is where modern audiences often misunderstand the story. When people heard sermons about forgiveness, release, and justice, they weren't hearing metaphors. They were hearing survival strategies. When they heard talk about the poor, they weren't imagining abstract compassion. They were thinking about themselves. Forgiveness in this context didn't just mean emotional relief. It meant debt cancellation, reset, escape. And escape was rare. The Roman system wasn't designed to be humane. It was designed to be efficient. Stability mattered more than fairness. Revenue mattered more than lives. People worked harder and fell further behind. Productivity didn't create security. Growth didn't lift everyone. It lifted a few and crushed the rest. Everyone knew it. No one believed the system was fair. There was only endurance, resentment, and the hope that something might finally break the cycle. To understand why this pressure felt so suffocating, you have to look at the one institution people believed was supposed to protect them, the temple. Today, the temple in Jerusalem is often imagined as purely religious, a place of prayer and sacrifice. But economically, it was one of the most powerful financial institutions in the region. It functioned as a treasury, a bank, a tax authority, and a court all at once. Every adult Jewish male was required to pay an annual temple tax. It had to be paid in a specific silver coin that meant people had to exchange their money. Money changers handled this for a fee. Sacrificial animals were sold at temple-approved prices. Pilgrims paid to participate in worship. Religion didn't replace Roman extraction, stacked on top of it, and the temple elite were deeply tied to Roman authority. High priests were appointed with Roman approval. Stability mattered more than righteousness. Cooperation mattered more than justice. The institution that claimed moral authority also benefited from the same system that impoverished the people. This contradiction didn't go unnoticed. By the 1st century, resentment toward temple leadership was widespread. Not because people rejected faith, but because they saw hypocrisy. Access to God required payment. Forgiveness required sacrifice. Sacrifice required money. Charity couldn't fix this. It treated symptoms, not causes. This is the world Jesus spoke into when he talked about debt forgiveness. People understood it literally. When he spoke about release, they heard relief. When he spoke about the kingdom of God, they didn't hear abstraction. They heard an alternative order, one where the current system wasn't final. That's why his words mattered. And then came the moment that changed everything. When Jesus overturned the tables of the money changers, it wasn't just religious outrage. It was economic confrontation. He wasn't attacking prayer. He was attacking a system that monetized access to the sacred. Calling it a den of robbers wasn't symbolic. It was structural. It's crossed the line. Rome tolerated prophets. It tolerated teachers. What it didn't tolerate was instability. Temple authorities understood that unrest during Passover was dangerous. Crowds plus grievance led to rebellion. From their perspective, Jesus wasn't just preaching. He was disrupting flows, challenging legitimacy, undermining the balance that kept them in power and kept Rome satisfied. The conflict wasn't primarily theological. It was economic and political. Because once people stop accepting debt as destiny, extraction becomes harder to enforce. Within a generation, Judea exploded into revolt. By the year 70, Jerusalem was destroyed. The temple was dismantled, its treasury looted, its authority erased. Rome didn't just suppress rebellion, it removed the infrastructure that enabled resistance. But extraction didn't end. It intensified. Land consolidation accelerated. Control became more bureaucratic, more absolute. Rome won the territory, but it didn't fully win the story. Jesus hadn't led an army. He hadn't promised policy reform. What he challenged was the moral logic that made suffering feel inevitable and deserved. Small communities formed around different assumptions, shared resources, mutual aid, dignity not tied to wealth. These weren't revolutions. They were parallel ways of living inside the empire without accepting its moral economy. Rome could crush armies. It struggled to crush ideas that moved with people. Over time, the empire absorbed the very framework it couldn't eliminate. And in doing so, it quietly admitted something profound. Power couldn't rely on force alone. Moral legitimacy mattered. The economy of Jesus' time reveals an uncomfortable truth. Systems don't collapse just because they're unjust. They collapse when the stories that justify them stop working. History doesn't repeat, but it does expose patterns. And once you see how power defends itself not just with force, but with narratives, it becomes much harder to believe those narratives are accidental. If this changed how you see history, subscribe to American Life Guide. History has answers, you just have to know where to look.